Okay, today we're going to talk about cell membranes. And the cell membrane is one of the most important parts of the cell because things are constantly passing in and out of the cell, and it's important to have a fluid membrane that allows some things to pass through and some things to not pass through. We're going to talk about that next class. But the cell membrane is very important because it has some components that we need to talk about. So today we're going to talk about just the membrane parts and the parts that make up the membrane, because the cell membrane is a huge part of biology. You can't have life, you can't have biology, you can't have multi-cell organisms unless there's a way for the cells to communicate with each other. The cell membrane allows for that. Now there's a couple things in the cell membrane that we need to talk about, but first let's do a quick reminder of the phospholipids. As you can see here, I drew them with plenty of space in between so we can add some goodies. You can see that I already did. But the phospholipids, if you recall, the head, the glycerol head, is going to be polar, and the tails are going to be nonpolar. This makes the heads hydrophilic because water is also polar, and the tails hydrophobic because they want to hide from the water. They don't get along well with the water. As you remember us talking last unit, if you take a handful of these phospholipids, throw them in water, what's going to happen is that they're going to arrange just like this, where the heads are facing the water and the tails are not. Anyways, there's a couple of things in the cell membrane that are highly important, and we're going to cover them now. And the first thing is going to be cell proteins. You can see here I listed a couple purposes of the cell proteins, but basically they're proteins that span the length of the membrane, and they perform certain tasks: transport, recognition, adhesion, and communication. So first let's kind of talk about the structure of a cell protein. As you can see here, it spans the length of the membrane. And the first part that we need to talk about is that the parts that face the outer membranes, they're actually polar. Parts that face the inner membranes, they're actually going to be nonpolar. And this is caused by, if you recall, the amino acids that make up proteins, they're going to be polar or nonpolar, and it makes up the makeup of the protein. As you can see here, this protein is folded perfectly, so the nonpolar amino acids are in the inside of the membrane, the polar sides are in the outer membrane facing the water. So you see that this is important because if there's just one amino acid change that makes up the protein, it's going to cause the whole thing to misfold and not work. That's why it's very important, especially with proteins in the cell membrane, that they function perfectly, meaning that their primary structure cannot be altered in any way. If you have one polar amino acid substitute for a nonpolar one, it's going to interrupt this entire process. Now, I drew this one as an example, but this also is an example of a communication protein. We see here that there's a binding site that's going to bind with a molecule called a ligand. Ligand is just a general term for any kind of molecule that binds with a communication protein. We'll talk about some specific ones later. So here we have a ligand binding with the receptor on the communication protein. It's going to cause some kind of change in the cell. For example, almost every signaling system in our body uses these communication proteins. Thousands of them span each and every cell. And the next is going to be a transport protein called a channel protein. Channel proteins are like tunnels in the cell membrane. We're going to talk about next unit, or next part of this unit, that very few things can actually pass through the cell membrane naturally. To give you a preview, it's really only small nonpolar molecules and gases. Everything else needs help with a protein transporter. Now channels, for the most part, they can open and close. However, some of them are always open. To give you an example, ions. Ions are small molecules that take advantage of this transport protein. It's very important that cells are able to selectively have ions diffuse into the cell and out of the cell in order for the cell to send proper signals. So transport channel proteins, they usually let very small things through, especially ions. Also water. Water uses a special kind of channel protein called aquaporins. It allows water to pass through this nonpolar layer. An example of the importance of channel proteins is going to be the cystic fibrosis channel. Now what it is it's a protein, of course, that has a perfect structure, nonpolar inner and polar outer. And what it does is it allows passage of an ion called chlorine. Chlorine is really essential to making proper mucus. Mucus is actually two parts. It's actually saline and then the actual mucus. Creates a very watery mucus that's very fluid. If this channel protein is misfolded due to a change in the primary structure, it actually breaks. It actually doesn't work anymore. The end result is that chlorine cannot get out of the cell and it prevents saline from being produced. That's really bad because now you just have really thick mucus that gets into the lungs and causes respiratory dysfunction. So next are carrier transport proteins, which is here in green. What these do is these allow passage of large macromolecules like glucose. They bind with the carrier protein and they actually are transported through into the cell. So larger molecules use carrier proteins, and carrier proteins kind of, I guess you can say, escort the glucose molecule into the cell. Very important. We'll talk about many different types of carrier proteins later on. So it's important to note that channel and carrier proteins are very specific, meaning there's a different protein for each type of molecule that it transports. There are very few that are general. Next, we're going to talk about glycolipids and glycoproteins. Glyco means sugar, and protein, of course, is protein. Lipid means fat, and glyco is going to be sugar. So basically, we have glycoproteins and also its close cousin, glycolipids. I drew here a glycoprotein, has an integral protein that spans the length of the membrane, and a carbohydrate. Now, glycoproteins and glycolipids have many functions. You could write an entire textbook on glycoproteins and glycolipids. So we're just going to focus on two parts here, recognition and adhesion. Each cell has a very specific pattern of glycoproteins and glycolipids. These almost act as like a name badge for the cell. And it's important because it allows the immune system to identify which cells belong in the body and which ones don't. For example, bacteria have a much different glycoprotein and glycolipid pattern than our own cells do. This allows the immune system to recognize them as foreign and then destroy them. Unfortunately, this also happens with blood typing. If you get a blood diffusion or transfusion, I guess it's called, then you are going to have someone else's blood put into your body. Now, someone that has type A blood, for example, is going to have different glycoproteins than someone that has type B blood. If you have type B blood and you receive someone's blood that has type A, you're going to have different sets of glycoproteins. The immune system is going to detect that. It's going to view it as a pathogen, something that can harm you, and it's going to cause it to clot, which can cause a fatal reaction in the body. That's why people that have type O protein, type O means nothing. Their blood does not have glycoproteins, therefore there's nothing for the immune system to detect, and someone that has type O blood can donate to anyone. It's also very important for cell-to-cell adhesion. So many cells produce a glycoprotein called collagen, for example. Collagen acts as a molecular glue, so to speak, that keeps cells stuck together. So glycoproteins and glycolipids are responsible for cells powerfully binding to each other. So this is it for proteins, but there's other things that are in the cell as well. One of those things that's very important is a molecule that's not quite a lipid, but still has nonpolar properties, and that's called cholesterol. Cholesterol is a very, very important part of the cell membrane. I know that cholesterol is demonized by the media, but you need cholesterol for hormones and you need cholesterol for cell membranes. And basically what these do is that they're actually very hard. They actually sneak between the phospholipids like this. And what they do is they actually cause the phospholipids to kind of stick together. And it also forms sort of a thick glue that keeps the phospholipids from drifting apart. What they also do is they make the phospholipid membrane temperature resistant. If you didn't have cholesterol, the moment the body temperature changes, the moment that it gets either too hot or too cold, the phospholipids will dissociate. Cholesterol keeps the phospholipid membrane not only stable shape, but it prevents it from falling apart for temperature change. So these are examples of cholesterol that I drew between the cell membrane. Very important parts of the cell membrane. So we have here, let's just recap this. We have the phospholipid membrane that's made up of fats and glycerol. Recall that phospholipids, the head is glycerol, tail is going to be fatty acids, and we actually have here two separate phospholipids lining the inner part of the cell and the outer part of the cell, because of course water is found in both inside and outside the cells, and the non-polar tails make up the inner membrane. Now, this is great as far as giving the cell really great properties like being fluid and allowing for things to diffuse through, but also needs some help with proteins. One type of protein is a communication protein, which binds with a signaling molecule of some sort called a ligand, and it causes it to tell the cell to do something. And of course, we know that proper folding is really important because the head is going to be polar, not head. The outer part is going to be polar, the inner part is going to be non-polar, so it can function normally. Next, we have transport proteins, carrier and channel. As we talked about, channel is small molecules like water and ions. Carriers are large molecules like glucose. Then, of course, we have glycoproteins and glycolipids. They're important for recognition and cell-to-cell adhesion. And cholesterol keeps the cell membrane rigid, so to speak, and helps it to prevent temperature change. By not prevent temperature change, I mean it helps it to stay stable in spite of temperature change. So these are the principles of the cell membrane, and I encourage you to check out the PowerPoint that I posted because it has additional information on the cell membrane. Now what you're going to do for your classwork is you're going to work on the problem set that I posted. And there's, I believe, 3 or 4 problems at the end of the PowerPoint. Work on them, collaborate with your teammates, also known as your classmates, and then we'll reflect upon this next class.